The last thing Sawyer expected that evening was to find himself kneeling on the side of a highway, rain drenching his shirt as he worked to fix a sleek, black luxury car with a flat tire. He wiped the back of his hand against his forehead, glancing up at the woman sitting inside. The tinted window rolled down just enough for him to see a pair of striking green eyes watching him cautiously. "You sure you can handle this?" she asked, her voice smooth but doubtful. Sawyer huffed a laugh, his rough hands expertly working the jack into place. "Lady, I've been fixing cars since I was 12. I think I can manage a flat tire." Inside the car, Isla Kensington bit her lip, her designer dress feeling almost ridiculous in this situation. She had never been stranded before, let alone in the middle of nowhere with a stranger kneeling beside her car. But she had no choice. Her driver had taken the night off, and she had insisted on driving herself. Now, she was stuck on the side of the road in the pouring rain, with a mechanic who looked like he belonged in a magazine instead of a roadside repair shop. His dark hair was soaked, strands sticking to his forehead, and his white T-shirt clung to his frame, revealing the kind of muscles that didn't come from sitting behind a desk. Isla wasn't used to men like him, men with grease-stained hands and a cocky confidence that didn't come from money or power, but from knowing exactly what they were doing. The car suddenly shifted, and Isla let out a small gasp as Sawyer steadied it effortlessly. "Relax," he said, not looking up as he worked. "I got this." She wasn't sure why, but she believed him. A few minutes later, he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're good to go." Isla hesitated before stepping out of the car, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. She pulled out her wallet, reaching for cash. "How much do I owe you?" Sawyer's jaw tightened. "Nothing," she frowned. "I insist." He shook his head, crossing his arms. "I don't take money for helping someone stuck on the side of the road." Isla studied him, unused to people refusing her money. Everyone had a price except, apparently, this man. It was oddly refreshing. "Well, thank you then." Sawyer nodded, already turning back to his truck, but something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way she stood there, staring at him like she wasn't sure what to do next. Or maybe it was the fact that, despite the expensive car and designer dress, she looked lost. "You shouldn't be driving alone this late," he said, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. Isla raised a brow. "I think I'll be fine." Sawyer exhaled. "If you say so." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, oil-stained card. "If you ever need help again, call me." She took the card carefully, glancing at his name, Sawyer Maddox. Simple. No titles, no flashy branding, just a man who fixed cars. "Thanks," she said softly. He nodded once before climbing into his truck and driving off, leaving Isla standing there, staring at the card like it was something more than just a mechanic's number. She had no idea why, but she had a feeling she hadn't seen the last of Sawyer Maddox. 2 days later, Isla found herself staring at the oil-stained card still sitting on her marble kitchen counter. She had no reason to call him, no excuse to see him again, and yet she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, not like she was someone untouchable, but like she was just another person who needed help. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts as her best friend, Leela, waltzed into the kitchen, designer sunglasses perched atop her head. "You've been staring at that thing for, like, 5 minutes." "What is it?" Isla picked up the card and twirled it between her fingers. "Just a mechanic's number." Leela quirked a brow. "Since when do you keep mechanics' numbers?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Since one of them helped me the other night." A slow, knowing smile crossed Leela's face. "And let me guess, he was ridiculously good-looking." Isla rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. Leela gasped. "Oh my God, you like him." "Absolutely not," Isla said too quickly. "Please, you're blushing." Isla set the card down with a sigh. "He's just different." Leela tilted her head. "Different how?" "I don't know. He didn't care who I was or that I could pay him. He just helped and walked away." Leela tapped her manicured nails against the counter. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Isla glanced at the card again, something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. A few hours later, Isla found herself standing outside a small auto shop on the edge of town. It was nothing like the polished, high-end places she usually frequented. The sign above the garage was faded, the concrete floors stained with years of work. It smelled like oil and metal, and for some reason she liked it. Sawyer was under the hood of a car, his back to her, as she stepped inside. She hesitated, feeling wildly out of place in her tailored coat and heeled boots. One of the other mechanics noticed her first. He wiped his hands on a rag, giving her a once-over before calling out, "Hey, Maddox, you've got a visitor." Sawyer straightened, turning toward her. His brows lifted in surprise before he grabbed a nearby towel and wiped the grease from his hands. "You lost again, Princess?" he asked, folding his arms. She ignored the nickname. "I wanted to thank you properly." He leaned against the workbench, studying her. "You already did." Isla hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she had misread something that wasn't even there. Sawyer must have seen the flicker of doubt cross her face because his expression softened. "Why don't you come back here?" She hesitated but stepped forward, weaving past cars in various states of repair. He gestured to the hood he had been working under. "Ever seen an engine up close?" She shook her head. Sawyer grabbed her hand without warning, guiding it to rest against the edge of the car. His touch was warm, roughened by years of work. "This is the heart of the car," he explained, his voice steady. "It's what keeps everything running." She looked up at him, realizing he wasn't just talking about the car. Something between them shifted in that moment, the air growing heavier. Sawyer cleared his throat and stepped back. "So why'd you really come?" Isla wasn't sure anymore. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else entirely. "I just wanted to see you again," she admitted. Sawyer exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "That's probably not a good idea." Isla stiffened. "Why not?" He looked at her, really looked at her. "Because we come from two different worlds and those don't usually mix well." She lifted her chin. "Maybe I don't care about that." Sawyer held her gaze for a long moment before shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "Your trouble, Kensington." For the first time in a long time, Isla found that she didn't mind. The last thing Sawyer expected was to find Isla Kensington standing in his garage again. But there she was, looking completely out of place among the grease-stained floors and humming machinery. He should have told her to leave, should have reminded her that whatever curiosity she had about his world would eventually fade. Instead, he found himself watching her, waiting to see what she'd do next. She lifted a delicate hand and gestured toward the car he had been working on. "What's wrong with it?" Sawyer wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the workbench. "Transmission issue." "It's been stalling out." She nodded as if she understood, but the slight crease in her brow told him otherwise. Still, she didn't turn away, didn't seem bored or impatient. "You really don't belong here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Isla tilted her head. "And yet here I am." Sawyer exhaled, shaking his head. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Why does that bother you?" He could have laughed, if only she knew. He wasn't blind, he saw the way people reacted when she walked into a room, the way they recognized the name Kensington and adjusted their posture accordingly. He had no interest in being another person drawn into her orbit, another fleeting moment in a life filled with luxury and expectations he couldn't begin to understand. But something about her made it hard to walk away. "You don't seem like the type to chase after things you don't understand," Sawyer said finally. Isla didn't flinch. "Maybe I want to understand." He studied her for a long moment, waiting for the usual signs: boredom, impatience, the realization that this wasn't her world and never would be. But none of that came. Instead, she reached out, tracing a finger over the metal surface of the car beside him. "Show me," she said softly. Sawyer narrowed his eyes. "You want a lesson in car repair?" She nodded once. He should have said no. Should have told her to go back to wherever she came from and forget about whatever this was. Instead, he grabbed a wrench and placed it in her hand. "All right, Princess," he said. "Let's see what you've got." An hour later, Isla's hands were covered in grease, and she had never felt more out of her element. But for some reason, she didn't hate it. Sawyer had been patient, guiding her through the basics, showing her how to check the oil, explaining the purpose of different tools. She had never paid attention to things like this before, not because she didn't care, but because no one had ever expected her to. But Sawyer didn't treat her like she was fragile. He handed her tools without hesitation, let her struggle through simple tasks without stepping in too quickly. And when she finally managed to loosen a particularly stubborn bolt, he gave her a slow nod of approval. "Not bad," he admitted. Isla grinned, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, only to realize too late that it left a streak of grease across her skin. Sawyer let out a low chuckle. "You've got a little something," he gestured vaguely toward her face. She frowned, reaching up, but only made it worse. Sawyer sighed and grabbed a clean rag. Without thinking, he reached out and wiped the smudge from her cheek, his fingers brushing against her skin for the briefest moment. The movement was casual, almost absent-minded, but the second it happened, the atmosphere shifted. Isla stilled. Sawyer hesitated, his gaze locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Sawyer took a deliberate step back, tossing the rag onto the workbench. "You should probably get going." Isla's stomach twisted at the sudden change in his tone. "Because I don't belong here." His jaw tightened. "Because this isn't a game," she straightened. "And what if it's not a game to me?" Sawyer exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Then that's a problem." She didn't look away. "Why?" "Because I don't fit into your world, Isla, and you don't fit into mine." She could have argued, could have told him that she wasn't some fragile thing that would break if she stepped outside of her comfort zone. But instead, she just watched him, waiting to see if he'd say what he really meant. Sawyer clenched his fists. "Go home, Isla." She swallowed hard, then nodded once. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the garage. And for the first time in a long time, Sawyer hated watching someone leave. Isla couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in that garage the way Sawyer had guided her hands, the unexpected warmth of his touch, the look in his eyes when he told her to leave. It wasn't rejection, it was something else, something unresolved. By morning, she had made her decision. When she pulled up to his auto shop again, she half expected him to turn her away. Instead, she found him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with unreadable eyes. "Stubborn," he muttered. "You walked away first," she countered. Sawyer exhaled, shaking his head slightly, like he couldn't believe she was back. But he didn't tell her to go. She stepped closer, closing the space between them. "I don't care about different worlds, Sawyer, and I don't believe you do either." He studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he reached for her wrist, fingers trailing lightly over her skin before he turned her hand over, palm up. His own hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was careful. Deliberate. "You don't know what it's like," he said quietly, "to fight for every inch of what you have." Her heart twisted. "And you think I've never fought for anything?" His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She took a step even closer. "You're right, I grew up in a world where things were handed to me. But that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to want something that feels just out of reach." His gaze flickered, something shifting in his expression. "I want you, Sawyer," she whispered. "And I think you want me too." Whatever restraint he had been holding on to snapped. In one swift movement, he pulled her against him, his hands firm at her waist, his breath warm against her skin. "I tried to push you away," he murmured. "Tried to pretend this wouldn't work." "And," she breathed, his lips brushed against hers just barely. "And I was wrong." Then he kissed her, not tentative, not careful, but like he had been waiting for this moment as long as she had. Like he had finally stopped fighting what had been inevitable from the start. When they finally pulled apart, Isla rested her forehead against his, breathless. "No more walking away?" she asked. Sawyer's grip tightened on her waist. Not a chance. Sawyer hadn't planned on falling for Isla Kensington. But now, standing in the dimly lit garage with her still pressed against him, her breath warm against his skin. He knew there was no turning back. She traced her fingers lightly along the edge of his jaw, studying him like she was memorizing every detail. "So, what now?" she asked softly. He exhaled, his hands settling at her waist. "You tell me, princess." A slow smile crossed her lips. "I think I'd like to stay a while." For the first time in a long time, Sawyer didn't argue. The next few days passed in a way he never expected. Isla didn't just visit the garage, she stayed, watching him work, asking questions, even trying her hand at fixing small things under his guidance. She wasn't perfect at it, wasn't even particularly good, but she never complained, and he liked having her there, more than he wanted to admit. One afternoon, he caught her leaning against the open hood of a car, absent-mindedly tapping her fingers against the metal. Grease smudged the edge of her sleeve, and her hair was slightly out of place. "You keep this up, and people are going to start thinking you work here," he teased, wiping his hands on a rag. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Maybe I wouldn't mind that," Sawyer stilled, watching her carefully. "Isla," she straightened, brushing her hands together. "I know what you're going to say, that I don't belong here, that I have a whole different life waiting for me. Because it's the truth," she sighed, stepping closer. "Maybe I don't want that life anymore. Maybe I want something different." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping in. "And what happens when reality hits? When you remember what you're used to?" She held his gaze. "What if I already have? What if I'm choosing this anyway?" Sawyer wanted to believe her. But he also knew what it was like to want something and realize too late that it wasn't sustainable. Before he could respond, the sharp rev of an engine outside caught their attention. Isla turned just as a sleek black car pulled up to the shop. The door opened, and a man stepped out tall, well-dressed, with an air of authority Sawyer recognized instantly. Isla inhaled sharply. "Dad," Sawyer's jaw tightened. Her father's gaze swept over the garage, then landed on Isla. "I was wondering where you'd run off to." She crossed her arms. "I didn't run off. I just needed space." Her father's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his posture that made Sawyer uneasy. "And this is where you found it." He turned his attention to Sawyer, assessing him with a look that said he had already decided this was a mistake. Sawyer wiped his hands on his jeans. "Something I can help you with." Isla's father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at his daughter. "Isla, we need to talk, alone." She hesitated before nodding. "Fine." Sawyer watched as they stepped outside, his chest tightening. Minutes ticked by, and when Isla finally returned, her expression was unreadable. "What did he say?" Sawyer asked. She hesitated, then exhaled. "He reminded me of everything waiting for me, the company, the expectations, my life." Sawyer nodded, bracing himself. And she stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "And I told him I wasn't ready to leave." His heart pounded. "Isla, I know it won't be easy," she interrupted. "I know there are things we'll have to figure out, but I don't care about any of that. I care about you." For the first time since meeting her, Sawyer let himself believe it. He cupped her face, brushing his thumb gently along her cheek. "You're really staying," she smiled, eyes bright. "I'm really staying." And for the first time in his life, Sawyer Maddox let himself have something he never thought he could, a future with the woman who had turned his world upside down. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as Isla stood beside Sawyer, her fingers still laced through his. The weight of her decision settled between them, not heavy with doubt, but with something far more certain: commitment. She had chosen to stay, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was standing on solid ground, not because of expectation or duty, but because she wanted to be there. Sawyer studied her quietly, his grip firm but gentle. He had spent his life avoiding things that felt too good to be true, and yet here she was, refusing to walk away. He exhaled, tilting his head slightly as if trying to figure out what to do with the woman who had turned his world inside out. A low rumble of an approaching car broke the silence. Isla turned as the sleek black vehicle that had carried her father earlier that day returned, Only this time, it wasn't just him. The back door swung open, and her mother stepped out, her expression unreadable behind her designer sunglasses. Sawyer tensed beside her, but Isla didn't move. Her mother approached, heels clicking against the pavement, stopping just short of her daughter. She removed her sunglasses, revealing sharp eyes that flickered between Isla and Sawyer. "You've made quite the impression," she said, addressing Sawyer directly. He didn't flinch, didn't waver. Not sure if that's a compliment or a warning. A ghost of a smile crossed her mother's lips before she turned her attention back to Isla. "Your father is convinced you'll come to your senses. I, however, know you better than that." Isla lifted her chin. "Then you know I'm not leaving." Her mother sighed, her gaze softening just enough to reveal something Isla hadn't expected understanding. "You always were the stubborn one." Isla crossed her arms. "I prefer determined." Her mother glanced at Sawyer again. "And you're certain about this?" Sawyer didn't hesitate. "Yeah." A long pause stretched between them before her mother finally nodded. "Then I suppose we should stop trying to fight it." Isla blinked, caught off guard. "You're not going to argue?" Her mother exhaled, shaking her head. "I've spent years telling you what your life should look like. Maybe it's time I let you decide for yourself." Isla's throat tightened. She had expected resistance, a fight, but not this. Not acceptance. Her mother reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, pressing it into Isla's hand. "If you ever change your mind, you know where to find us." Isla clutched the envelope, but didn't look at it. "I won't." A flicker of something pride, maybe passed through her mother's expression before she stepped back. "Then take care of yourself." She turned to leave, pausing only once to glance at Sawyer. "And take care of her." "I will," he said, his voice steady. With that, her mother slipped back into the car, and a few moments later it disappeared down the road. Isla let out a slow breath, her grip on the envelope loosening. Sawyer nudged her lightly. "You okay?" She looked up at him, and for the first time in a long time she felt free. "Yeah," she said, smiling. "I really am." That evening, Sawyer took her on a ride through the outskirts of town, the wind whipping through her hair as they drove down open roads with no real destination. He didn't take her to a fancy restaurant or a private event. He took her somewhere real, somewhere untouched by expectations. They ended up at a quiet overlook, the city lights flickering in the distance. Isla leaned against the hood of his truck, staring out at the view while Sawyer stood beside her. "This is the part where you ask me if I regret staying," she said, glancing at him. He slid his hands into his pockets. "Do you?" She turned fully, facing him. "Not even for a second." Sawyer didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You changed everything," he admitted quietly. Isla smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "So did you." He studied her for a long moment before pulling her closer, wrapping his arms around her like he never wanted to let go. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. They had come from two different worlds, but somehow they had found their way to the same place. And that was enough. No more walking away, no more doubts, just them together. Forever.